Hello, I'm Dr. Jang, a neuroscientist. It's nice to meet you. Hello. Is your life currently going smoothly like you're on a well-paved road? Or does it feel like things are all twisted and tangled up? Which one is it for you? Probably there are very few people whose lives are truly going exactly as planned, just the way they wanted. But when we look at other people, it often seems like their lives are going perfectly smoothly. In reality, when we experience life, we don't go through it continuously like a video, but rather as a series of snapshots, moment by moment. Not only the life we remember, but even video footage itself may seem continuous when we watch it. Yet in reality, our brains perceive movement by rapidly processing 24 to 30 still images per second. It's the same when we experience someone else's life. In fact, we experience other people's lives on social media, on Instagram, on YouTube, only through brief moments. Even with people we know well or are very familiar with, we probably only experience their lives through the brief, fleeting scenes we see when having coffee or dinner together. Because of that, it can sometimes feel like my own life is all crumpled and messy, while only other people's lives seem smooth and beautiful. But if we look closely, there are probably far more tangled, complex, and complicated moments in everyone's life than we might initially realize. And in fact, I even think that maybe it's actually this continuous and ongoing series of tangled moments that truly makes up life. When we say that life is tangled, we usually mean that things aren't going according to plan. However, did you know that? The reason we have a brain is because it evolved for us to use when things don't go according to plan. In fact, beings without brains go through life with everything unfolding exactly as planned. That's because, in the case of amoebas, bacteria, or plants which don't have brains, they live according to the plan set by their genes, by their DNA. Even if the environment suddenly changes and toxins appear in the place where they always used to find food, since they live only according to the plan set by their genes, they can't respond to such changes. On the other hand, beings with brains, if the world changes and what they originally thought was food turns out to be a tool, and they survive after experiencing that, although their original genes, their programming, tell them to go and eat it again, they can learn from the experience and reprogram themselves to never go there again. In other words, they gain the ability to reprogram their own behavior. So, the moment when the brain truly demonstrates its abilities is not when things go according to plan, but when things don't go as planned and get tangled up. The brain evolved to find new paths and new possibilities in such situations. Perhaps the reason I became a neuroscientist is because throughout my life, I often found myself needing to use my brain. In other words, I think there were quite a few moments in my life when things got tangled up. In fact, these stories have been quite personal, so I haven't really shared them in lectures before, but today in this SEBASI talk, I'd like to open up about them. I was born in Germany and spent my childhood there. My parents were international students, and even after graduating, they found jobs in Germany, worked hard, and diligently earned money to send back to their parents and siblings in Korea. They lived that way for almost 20 years. The money they earned was sent to my father's childhood friend in Korea. With the thought that someday we would return to Korea, they entrusted all the money they had worked so hard to earn over those 20 years to my dad's friend, so he could buy land and a house for us, making sure we could live well. Then, when I was 6 years old, around 1986, my mother and father decided to return to Korea. Still, since we are Korean, people of our homeland, my parents decided that they should spend their later years and live in Korea. So they wrapped up their life in Germany. And my mother even went so far as to burn her German permanent residence permit on purpose, saying, "We're never coming back here again. We're going to live in our homeland," she said, and return to Korea. But as soon as we returned to Korea, what we experienced was that my father's friend had used up everything, left only debts behind, and ran away overseas. All the money was gone, only debt remained, and so, in a tiny basement room in Yeokcheon-dong, Yeonpyeong-gu, Seoul, the four of us began our life in Korea by experiencing a new kind of hardship that was very different from our previous life in Germany. So, in fact, things were already going wrong from the very start in Korea. Instead of returning home in glory and starting our life in Korea on a smooth path, everything suddenly began with new poverty and challenges. By then, I was 8 years old and had to go to elementary school. But after entering elementary school, what I experienced was not the start of a happy school life, but rather receiving a 3-in-1 gift set all at once: physical punishment, bullying, and school violence. Because I had lived in Germany, my way of speaking and my lifestyle were different. So unfortunately, I ended up experiencing severe bullying, school violence, and physical punishment. My parents even went to the point of saying, "You shouldn't have to go through such hardship at a school like this. Just don't go to school. Let's study at home instead." So unintentionally, in the mid 1980s, I ended up being homeschooled. And for almost 9 years, I rarely attended school. Eventually, I earned my middle school diploma by passing the equivalency exam. But while studying at home, I realized that I was really good at studying and that I liked languages and math. So my parents started to have higher expectations. So they made me study more and more. And by the time I graduated elementary school, I was already reading high school math books. They said, "Hey, since you're so good at studying, let's have you skip grades and get into a top university when you're 14 or 15. They wanted me to pass the equivalency exams right away and get ahead with advanced studies. So I ended up skipping 3 grades in no time and took the middle school equivalency exam. My parents' ambition was for me to become a student who entered a top university early. The problem was that, once again, Korea was approaching an economic crisis, and my father was scammed once more, this time not by a hometown friend, but by an army buddy. As our family's financial situation became more difficult, it was obvious that my parents' relationship would inevitably become even more strained. Due to that, with my parents constantly fighting and our financial difficulties, it just wasn't possible to study at home under those circumstances. So during that time, we faced another crisis, had to move, and went through various hardships. And as I hit puberty during that period, I started to go astray. Within about a year, both my paternal and maternal grandfathers passed away. The conflicts at home increased, and we faced even more financial hardship. In that situation, for about 2 years, I became a juvenile delinquent hanging out on the streets, drinking, smoking, and living the life of a runaway. During that time, I traveled all over the country. I met other kids touting in front of sashimi restaurants in Busan, and sometimes they let me sleep in the rooms behind those restaurants. In Seoul, I joined a band club and met musicians, and I would sleep in their practice rooms. For a few weeks, I even experienced sleeping at Seoul Station, covering myself with newspapers inside the cardboard boxes that the homeless people had stacked up. Instead of just being a kid who skipped grades, went to college early, and only did well in school, I was really living on the streets, wondering every day which church I needed to go to in order to get a meal, or where I would sleep that night. After spending several weeks living like that, I would go back home for a while, then leave again, alternating between these two lives. But I think the experiences I had during that time really opened my eyes in a different way. For me, meeting various troubled youths who had left home because of their own pain, rather than everyone in the world just being good at studying and living an easy life, was a time when I could get along with different people and really experience that there are all kinds of people out there. And then after finishing high school, I went to study in Germany again. I started studying biology in Germany, but at first I didn't like biology. So I switched majors on my own and enrolled in the philosophy department. But after enrolling in the philosophy department and studying there for about 2 years, I had to take the graduation exam to move from bachelor's to master's. Suddenly, the German government asked, "We issued your visa for a biology major, so why did you switch to philosophy on your own? Either go back to Korea or take the exam in biology." So I barely managed to avoid failing and just scraped by with straight D's in all subjects and somehow passed. I was so frustrated at that time that I thought, whatever. And then by chance, another opportunity came up in Germany. So I received a scholarship and ended up going to study in the United States. When I went to the States, I encountered neuroscience and cognitive science for the first time, and I found them incredibly interesting, different from anything before. I developed a strong desire to research this field, so I worked hard, studying 14 hours a day and working in the lab. Then, a very famous professor said, "All right, join our lab." And I received an offer to enter a PhD program in my early 20s. Oh, things were going so well. But the problem was that in the US, there's a combined master's and PhD program, while in Germany, there's a combined bachelor's and master's program. Because of this, I had to go back to Germany and finish my degree for another 6 months before I could come to the US and enter the PhD program. But when I went back to Germany, the advisor who was supposed to grant me my degree suddenly got a heart attack and passed away. And after that, successor to the professor wasn't appointed, and I was left in limbo for 2.5 years. Because I was left hanging for 2.5 years, I ended up going back to the US to get my PhD, but I missed the chance to earn my doctorate in my 20s. And during this period, I suddenly developed depression. My health deteriorated, I got a herniated disc, my thyroid failed, and I basically lived like an invalid. I suffered from severe depression and even attempted suicide. Instead of overcoming all this and seizing opportunities by working hard after returning to the US, I ended up receiving psychiatric treatment in Germany, unable to submit a single assignment, constantly postponing everything, and spent those 2.5 years in a state of limbo. In the end, the chance to enter a PhD program slipped away from me. Since we as Korean men must serve by 28, finishing a PhD in 1 or 2 years seemed out of reach. So I thought to myself, it's over. Things aren't going as planned. Now, the only thing left for me is to somehow get my diploma and then go back to Korea to serve in the military. So I think during that time, my body probably broke down because my spirit was crushed, which led me to a lifestyle that ended up damaging my health as well. So I barely managed to finish my master's degree and then returned to Korea to complete my military service. And after finishing my military service, since I had experience working at a good research institute in Germany and had even received a PhD offer from the US, I thought that if I applied again and went back to Germany, things would work out well. But I applied to 20 places in Germany, and I was rejected by all of them. When I was already in Germany and inside the system, it was easy to move from one place to another, but after coming back to Korea, finishing my military service, and then trying to return to Germany, I realized the competition was incredibly fierce and the doors didn't open so easily again. I realized that this wasn't as easy as I thought. When I still had the opportunity, it was easy to switch or move to somewhere else. But after coming back to Korea, serving in the military, and then submitting my application again, I realized that applications from someone with the surname Jang, from some distant corner of Asia, whether from China or Korea, were so numerous that many of them probably ended up in the trash without even being looked at on someone's desk. In fact, I sent my application to a renowned professor in Germany, and the reply I received still remains a scar in my heart. "We don't need a person like you. We don't need someone like you." This is how it came. The reason that sentence still sticks with me is, "Oh, do you even know me? Have you ever even met me to know who I am? Did you even give me a chance? What did I do wrong? I poured my passion into that application, and yet I get a reply saying, 'We don't need someone like you.' It was incredibly hurtful. It was a lab I really liked, respected so much, and truly wanted to join. And then to receive a response saying, 'We don't need someone like you,' wow, I was truly shocked. And since no one accepted me, I ended up giving up on pursuing a PhD. And in Korea, I had to find a job and work at whatever position I could get. But out of pure determination and anger, I kept applying for PhD programs the following year, and the year after that as well. I kept submitting the exact same application. But interestingly, in the year after that, I submitted the same application and got accepted to 6 places. So I ended up going back to one of those places, and finally I was able to earn my PhD in neuroscience and return to Korea. By the way, thank you. For reference, I once attended a conference where a professor who had emailed me saying, "We don't need someone like you," was present. I gave a presentation there. Afterwards, that professor came up to me and said, "That was a great presentation. What kind of research do you do?" he asked me. And later on, I got my revenge. I spoke to the professor. I asked, "Do you remember replying to me some time ago that you didn't need someone like me?" Then the professor replied after a thoughtful pause, "Oh, That sentence didn't mean what you thought it did. At the time, I simply wasn't able to accept any students, not just someone like you, but in fact, I couldn't take on any PhD students at all. That's what I actually meant. So I was hurt all by myself, but what the professor actually meant was that no matter how good a student applied, he simply couldn't accept any students at that time. He was just saying, that's simply the situation I am in. What I realized at that time was that every little thing, every single word, hurt me deeply. And when things didn't work out or got complicated, I was really wounded by it. But as it turns out, that's what the PhD process is like. In the end, it all comes down to timing and circumstances lining up. Whether you get in or not depends on that. Since the program lasts 5 or 6 years, a spot only opens up when a student finishes and leaves. That's when opportunities arise. If there's no research funding, and while students are still working on their research, you can't be accepted. So no matter how good a student is, if I'm not in a position to take them, I simply can't accept them. Later on, I realized that when someone applies, timing often matters more than ability. It's the same with getting a job. There are years when big companies hold open recruitments and years when they don't. Some years there are lots of opportunities and other years there aren't. So in the end, I used to think it was my own problem, but in reality, it was just a matter of bad timing, and I ended up blaming myself unnecessarily. So the conclusion I reached at that time was that if you keep applying and keep knocking, the door of opportunity will eventually open. It's not a problem with you, but a matter of timing. So the only answer is to keep trying consistently. Now, let me ask you a question in return. In my teens, my life was tangled. In my 20s, it was tangled. In my 30s, it was tangled. It was just one complication after another. If I had taken the smooth path and entered a top university at 14 as planned, would I have been a happier person? Probably not. In fact, I think that if I had gone there and seen so many other smart people working, I would have struggled because I wouldn't have fit in well with those who entered at 20 after finishing all their high school exams. Since I would have entered at 14, if I had gone to the US in my 20s and gotten my PhD in my 20s, things might have worked out well then too, but I wouldn't have the experiences and stories I have now. Similarly, if all the applications I submitted to Germany from Korea had been accepted, I probably wouldn't have met my current wife, and I wouldn't be married as I am now. In a way, I think those things became opportunities that made my life richer. Everyone, do you feel anxious about your future? Are you afraid? Do you feel like something painful might happen? If so, there's an experiment I'd like to share with you. It's an experiment by a neuroscientist named Jamie Rudy who studies pain and suffering. He defined fear and anxiety as two different things. So, what is fear? Fear is when you've experienced pain and you're afraid you might feel that pain again next time. But let's say instead, you see someone else in pain. You think you might be sick too. In other words, even though you haven't experienced the pain yourself, you see it coming or imagine it happening to you. That's what we call anxiety. So we divide the mice and people into 3 groups. One group receives electric shocks 3 times. They scream. It hurts. It hurts. After that, they're scared that it might hurt again next time. This first group is the one that experiences pain and is made to feel fear. The second group watches someone else in pain. The red light comes on and it hurts. The red light comes on and it hurts again. But then the red light comes on in front of me. Thinking it's going to hurt, anxiety starts to rise. And then, in an extremely anxious state, they experience pain. Now, the third group is the one that doesn't experience anything. No fear, no anxiety, nothing at all. So, among these 3 groups, which group actually felt the least pain when they experienced it? It was the first group, the ones who were afraid because they'd experienced pain. This group was scared, but when the pain actually came, they thought, huh? It doesn't hurt as much as I thought. Their sensitivity to the pain had decreased. On the other hand, which group felt the most pain? I'm so anxious and scared. Ugh. The group that thought it's going to hurt had the highest sensitivity when the pain actually came, so they felt the most pain. So, going back, when life gets tangled, when we feel anxious about the future and are afraid things won't work out, What should we do? Every life gets tangled up. Since it's bound to get tangled anyway, let's just go for it. Let's face it. People who boldly confront their tangled lives, even if it hurts, feel pain only for a short while and then it's over. Now, if we compare the effects on the brain of stress that comes from briefly confronting and challenging yourself, even if it hurts, with the stress from chronic anxiety that arises from ongoing worry, the stress you get from facing challenges head on, even if it's really tough and intense for a short time, is actually positive stress. After that, a lot of new nerve cells were generated around the hippocampus in the brain. Learning ability and memory capacity both increased. Not only that, but when they made mice go through tough situations, for example, when they had to run a lot, the mice that had to run while undergoing extreme physical hardship and stress, or the mice that were hungry and had nothing to eat, all of these are stressful situations. But in both groups, the results showed that the mice who had to run hard or were hungry because there was nothing to eat were healthier, lived longer, and developed more new brain nerve cells. On the other hand, in the group that experienced chronic anxiety, stress, not actual pain, but just constant worry, the creation of new brain cells actually decreased. And in fact, their health and all other aspects worsened. So, in the end, what we can say is that when life gets complicated, it can actually unlock new abilities within us. When we face challenges, it might hurt less than we expect, and we might learn something new. But if you only worry and never take on challenges, not only is that bad for your brain, but it also takes away opportunities to learn something new, which is the worst outcome. So what I want to tell you is that while other people's lives may look smooth and easy, in reality, all of our lives are tangled, and the reason we have brains is to untangle this series of complications in our lives. I'd like to end by saying that I support all of your new attempts. Every new attempt is right, and things get tangled so that they can be unraveled. This is what I want to say. I hope that all of you will be able to untangle the knots in your lives. And through that, I hope you gain many new abilities for your brain. Thank you.